I'm Alfred Perlman. I'm a railroad man, and I'd like to tell you something about our railroad and what we're doing on it. People tend to take the railroad pretty much for granted. We in the railroad business probably haven't told the story of the changing conditions in our...
I'm Phil Bell. I'm a railroad man too, and trains are in my blood. Today, railroads are telling the story of everything they do for America, right here on the All Aboard podcast. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this special episode of the All Aboard podcast by All Things Trains. Today, we are joint with our good friends at the Center for Transportation Advancement, which is a project of the Parkview Institute. And by the way, our friends are at the Center for Transportation Advancement because we are the Center for Transportation Advancement. So I would like to welcome our Executive Director, David Ozgo, back to the show. David, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Phil, it's always a pleasure to be here and always a pleasure to talk trains with you.
Thank you. All right. Now, before we get too deep into it, tell everybody a little bit about the Center for Transportation Advancement and where they can find us.
Certainly. Well, the Center for Transportation Advancement was really the brainchild of my friend here, Phil Bell. But our goal is really to advance transportation policy in the United States. Our last round of really deregulation occurred in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and it really helped to drive the economic growth that we enjoyed throughout the 1980s. Well, at the Center for Transportation Advancement, we're looking to duplicate that success. We believe that there are a number of potential opportunities out there, and transportation takes up around $5 trillion of our economy. It's something that we all buy, but we don't realize we're necessarily buying it. So to the extent that we can make transportation more efficient, we're going to make the economy more efficient, and that's good for everybody.
Yeah, and that's a great point. So you think about everything that we buy, everything that we use in some form, it had to be transported to us in some way. So even if you're not driving a truck, even if you're not riding, shipping on a train or riding a train or otherwise, it is coming to you some form in that. And my favorite example, and I did not realize this for a long time, Greyhound. For many years they operated Greyhound Package Express, but they would deliver a lot of the auto parts that people would use would be delivered on Greyhound buses. You wouldn't know it, but you had to get that part on your car fixed. It would probably be coming on the next bus. Now, it's a little bit of an antiquated example, but it is an example of how deeply entwined transportation is in every aspect of our lives. And that's what we talk about here at the Center for Transportation Advancement, so we can help set policies that make it cheaper to move things as well as more effective and give us more opportunities as much as possible. Now, coming up Friday, October 17th, is going to be the Advancing Transportation Conference. Now, I'm excited about this. You're going to have a big part in it. I'm going to have a little bit of a part in it as well. We have a former Surface Transportation Board Chairman, Roger Nober, who will be speaking, Craig Fuller, Chair of Firecrown Media and Head of Sonar. He will be speaking, and they will be demonstrating Sonar, which is a system of pricing on freight rates and the like, trucking and otherwise. So a lot of conversations with big leaders in the transportation industry and policymakers. So what I want you to do is click the link under the show so you can get your tickets today, because at the end of August the price goes up and we want to make sure you're there.
Well said, Phil, and I'm looking forward to the conference.
All right, well, today we're here to talk about a very, very interesting situation that bubbled up since I went on hiatus with this podcast, and that was when this little railroad that, maybe a few people have heard of, called the Union Pacific, struck a deal to merge with Norfolk Southern to create the United States' first true transcontinental railroad. A same company would own the rail lines between the East Coast and the West Coast. David, tell us about this, why this is significant, and how did we get here?
Well, Phil, I have to say this is really exciting. Probably the first person to really talk about a truly transcontinental railroad going end to end was, in fact, Abraham Lincoln. Now, when you look at how our railroad system developed here in the United States, it was really built between about 1820 and 1870. Well, if you go back to 1820 and 1870, what were we? We were not in a worldwide economy. We were not in a national economy. We were a lot of regional economies. So our railroad system was really built at a time when it was designed to serve regional economies. Well, flash forward, probably by about 1870, when we finally got to the West Coast, that's when the country began to develop into a national economy. Now, period about 1870 to 1900, 1910 is when we became a national economy, but by that point, the railroad system was really already established in the U.S. So this merger between Norfolk Southern and the Union Pacific is really going to bring the country together from a railroading perspective for the first time ever. Yeah, I know we've had the ability to go cross-country, but it was really a system that was cobbled together.
And to your point, one of the earliest predecessors of the Norfolk Southern, the Richmond and Danville, went between Richmond, Virginia and Danville, Virginia. Not very far, in the same state. In fact, it wasn't even allowed to merge with or acquire railroads that it connected to. That's why they had to create a holding company in order to do that. But that is the point you're making, a regional system that ultimately grew into a national system. Now, we've been talking about railroad mergers a lot. In fact, a couple episodes ago, we talked about the Penn Central and if the Penn Central was actually a successful railroad merger, which we can always debate whether a company that's the biggest bankruptcy in history is successful, but we'll get back to that. What is the rationale for Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern to merge, and why now?
Sure. Well, first off, it creates a truly national end-to-end railroad system. It's going to connect 100 different ports. I think it's 10 different international gateways. But more importantly, right now, sure, you can go from the East Coast to the West Coast, but you're going to have to interchange someplace. Well, interchange is the Achilles heel of the railroad system. We're great at the line haul. The interchange takes time, and time is money. In fact, right now, I believe about 6% of total traffic that go between the Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern are actually interchanged. And this amounts to around 1 million carloads per year. So right off the bat, you're going to, from just their perspective, their respective systems, you're going to take 6% of their traffic and eliminate 48 hours on average of interchange time. That's really huge from a cost savings perspective, but as importantly from a service perspective. It means that the shipper is going to have much better transit times and it's going to be a lot more reliable. So just looking at the merger of the two systems from an operational standpoint is really big. Secondly, it gives you so many new opportunities to really compete with intermodal.
Now, we were talking about this a little bit yesterday because you make a very good point in terms of interchange. So thinking about what interchange really looks like, because, we like to cover operations too. For example, you will have Norfolk Southern bring trains into Elkhart, Indiana, which was the former New York Central yard that was outside of Chicago. So it's probably about, I think, maybe 80 miles or so, thereabouts, before you get to Chicago. So you bring it there, and that's usually where they will classify traffic that's going to be handed off to other carriers in the Chicago Gateway. Then you're going to bring that traffic from Elkhart into Chicago, and you'll have to get another crew in order to take that to where it's supposed to go. So maybe some of this traffic might go north to the Proviso Yard, former Chicago Northwestern, very large facility that they have there. And once you get there, Union Pacific is going to take it and classify it and put it into another train. They're going to move out of the Proviso Yard, maybe up to the Twin Cities on the former CN&W route, or maybe they're going to take that west to Omaha or through the Omaha, which used to be a gateway, but not anymore because now there was consolidation to do that into further west, Denver area or otherwise. Now, if we're talking about a 48-hour wait potentially in order to get that traffic from a yard in Chicago to Proviso Yard and then getting it on the move again, time is money. So that's time and money being wasted, or maybe we shouldn't say wasted, not available. But now this is having a lot of changes. So for example, shippers can reduce their supply chains. Maybe you don't have to have as much money out there in order to cover inventory because you'll be able to get it from your supplier to you faster because 48 hours is removed from the schedule, for example.
48 hours is a long time, obviously. That's going to take people moving the trains around the railroad yards. And you're right, from the shipper's perspective, there are inventory carrying costs to having that product be in a railroad yard going through the interchange process. So ultimately, this is going to be good for the shippers. We talk about transit times. We talk about transit all the time. The shipper is paying to get something from point A to point B. The fact that it has to run around in a railroad yard for 2 days really is of no value to him.
And I'll add this, and it's getting a little in the weeds, but I think you'll appreciate it. Think about, we go back to the inventory carrying costs, so much of that ends up being borrowed money, right? So someone has to borrow money, interest rates are higher, they have to borrow money to buy inventory, they have to wait for that inventory to come to them, they have to process it before they can sell it to you. All of that is cost that's passed directly on to us. So even though 48 hours might be a small amount of time in the concept of a product from point A to point B, that ultimately means less money that's coming out of our wallets to buy our food, to buy our fuel, to buy things, our clothes, going back to school for kids that are doing that. That is a big benefit to consumers, and that could come from just this one merger transaction. Now, let me ask you this. We have already seen some opposition. We've heard some shippers complain, we've heard labor complain. What would you say if you had a rail customer come to you and say, David, I'm a little worried. I'm not, what could happen? Because back in the 1990s, we had some disruptions when mergers happen. What do you expect this time?
Sure. Well, mergers are never easy. Obviously, the NS is a very, very large and complex system. The Union Pacific is an even larger and more complex system. So as a result, yes, it's not an easy process, but ultimately the benefits, I believe, are going to be more than worth the cost. When you look at the competition that railroads right now are getting from the trucking industry, it's just huge. We're about to have a second revolution in the trucking industry. Autonomous vehicles now are being tested in Texas. Yeah. It's not going to be that long before you're going to see long-haul trucks going across the country without drivers. Well, the driver on a long-haul truck route is 30, 40, 50% of the total costs. So the railroads are faced right now with this challenge whereby all that intermodal traffic, it came from truck, it can go back to truck.
Yeah.
So to a large extent, I know that the railroads, UP and NS, have talked about the growth that this merger will bring to the railroad industry. I see it as much a defensive play because trying to compete with the trucking industry that no longer needs truck drivers for the line haul, that's going to be very, very challenging. So if you're a railroad shipper, even if you are, say, if you're not shipping intermodal, say you're shipping chemicals in bulk, well, I would say to you, look, every shipper on the railroad system pays for some of the overhead and maintenance of the track system and the total system. The fewer shippers that you have on that railroad, the more costs that are going to have to be absorbed by the other shippers. So as a result, this is as much a defensive play for railroad shippers and for the railroads themselves.
I agree with that, and I would say, agree with that completely, and I would say to shippers, one of the things that you should think about with this merger is it's end-to-end. So many of the mergers of the past have been parallel. You think about the merger in 1996 that created the current day Union Pacific, where the Southern Pacific was merged into Union Pacific. Although it wasn't so much lines running next to each other, by and large you had traffic that was moving in the same direction, east to west. And so it was, well, how do we combine, how do we get the economies of this and that? In this instance, now you're taking out the interchange points, so you're taking out that headache, and traffic is continuing in the same patterns. So that means if you're concerned about disruptions, any of that is going to be dramatically less than what you've seen in other areas. Plus, we also have the benefit of more than 20 plus years, actually 30 years now, when you look at that, of innovation in terms of information technology, which is always the Achilles heel of any merger in any industry. So it is going to be much better when you consider employment of devices like AI in order to say, hey, how are we going to understand where things are? How are we going to make sure that we keep track of company X, company Y, and company Z, and be able to put that together. And look no further than some of the recent mergers like CPKC. That was, comparatively very smooth. And what did you see? The exact same thing is happening with Union Pacific-Norfolk Southern. You're really going to see one carrier and the other carrier extending its operations as opposed to taking on something and trying to integrate it. So that's why I think there's going to be a lot more to relax about as opposed to worrying about from the shipper perspective. Now,
obviously, from the labor perspective, if I were labor, I would be concerned as well. You're looking for efficiencies, but given that they are selling this based upon a growth story, the president of UP has already said, look, we do not plan on laying anybody off. They plan on, their goal is to grow the system. I saw one projection where they believe they're going to bring in around $3 billion in new sales, new shipments.
That's impressive.
That's big. So the fact that they're looking at this not as, yes, there will be cost savings, but it's not. It's an end-to-end merger, and they plan to grow their freight, not simply reduce the headcount.
Right, and if you think about it, if you're working in some of these yards that might be speeded up or maybe no longer needed, there's going to be opportunities at others, and there's also going to be more opportunities in terms of the line haul in order to get more freight where it needs to go. So actually, I think this can be a bonanza for labor rather than something that's declining when you see the commitment by the companies to grow the business, and that is so critical.
That is very critical. When you look at the past 20 years, the complaint is that railroads have been doing nothing but raising their rates. Well, that can only go so far. We're at a point now where to grow, they really need to grow the business, and that's, based upon this $3 billion projection, to me, it looks like that's what they're driving for, is growth. They keep talking about being able to compete more directly with truck and bringing more traffic into intermodal. So as a result, it looks like a merger that's truly going to accomplish the goals that everyone has at the outset.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, the rate question, because that always does come up, and that's always an important question. I believe, and you're right, I think the period of raising rates by large amounts is probably over for a while. But at the same time, I actually don't think that was as ruinous if you really consider what the railroads are actually doing. So much of the money that railroads generate, the cash that they generate, goes right back into the physical plant. And one need to do no less than just go to a train line near you and take a look at it. So it's not just the track itself. It is the ballast that holds the track in place. That's the rock under the track. It's the subgrade that has to constantly stay in good shape in order for the ballast to stay in place and the track to stay in place, so that these millions of pounds of train and freight and so forth that go over it every year stay there. It's keeping the rail itself properly profiled, because they actually have machines that go out and make sure it's profiled properly, because a lot of people don't know this, but it is not the flanges that hold the train on the track, it is the profile of the rails and the wheels. All that has to be maintained. And everything that we're talking about is all before we talk about a single train itself. And let's not forget property taxes. Let's not forget making sure the right-of-way stays secure. Let's not forget the signals, because how else are you going to know who is allowed to move and who isn't without having good working signal systems, whether you have the actual signals themselves, whether you have cab signals, positive train control that we've heard so much about in all the years, and some of the more esoteric traffic warrants and so forth. All that has to be done. The radio broadcast, so the dispatcher can stay in touch with the trains. I'm not trying to give you an exhaustive list, but I am pointing out all of the places where that rate dollar does go, and all of those costs go up every year, just as it does for everything else. So raising rates wasn't so much a, hey, look, we're trying to profit off you, although profit matters, but even just keeping the doors open so that you can continue to ship was critical. And now as it goes to profits, let's also remember, every dollar that you get in order to keep that railroad going has to compete with AI. Why? Because AI is a big investment panacea that's out there. It has to compete with app development. It has to compete with internet content, everything that we're doing here, because dollars have a lot of places where they can be invested, and in order for a railroad to compete with that, they have to be able to generate profits so that shareholders will put capital in and that we can have these railroads. So I think I'm glad you mentioned that, and I think it's great that they were able to do all they could with that capital over these years.
Yeah, you know, Phil, I completely agree. Obviously, the challenge is going to now be to get the merger approved by the Surface Transportation Board. And it's my understanding that this is going to be the first railroad merger that's going to have to come under the more restrictive rules that the STB put forth in 2001, which is actually going to require them to show that service and competition will not only be maintained, but it will be actually increased. So, you know, they have their hands, they have their work cut out for them.
Keep talking, David, because I'm glad you mentioned that. So one of the things you should know about me is that I am a hoarder, a certified hoarder. And as a hoarder, I have a lot of old stuff. And one of those things is this railway age from January of 2000. Now you can see BNSF and Canadian National, this was the proposed merger that ultimately led to those rules that we're talking about now. This would have followed the Conrail division, it would have followed Union Pacific, Southern Pacific, would have followed Burlington Northern Santa Fe, created today's BNSF Railway, ultimately didn't happen, but this is an example, this was the genesis of the Surface Transportation Board saying, okay, we're not looking at mergers anymore as a panacea of railroad survival, we are looking at it in a different way. Now, everybody who was on that Surface Transportation Board, and that was the Linda Morgan era, for those who might remember, they're all gone. But the memories of the 1990s era remain, the questions will remain. Congress, even though the majority of Congress is completely different, they will have extensive hearings, ask a lot of questions. A lot of the states that are being served, they will ask questions. So this will be a Herculean task, but I agree with you. I think there is so much that's going into this that's positive that they will be able to overcome the questions that are there with very good answers.
You know, Phil, that's right, and particularly from the railroad's perspective, I mentioned earlier the fact that we are about to undergo a second revolution in truckload trucking. Well, as a result, the railroads are almost in a defensive position right now. They're going to have to have their own game changer. And, you know, taking interchanges out of the railroad system, taking a lot of interchanges out of the railroad system, I see as a very, very big step forward. Giving people access, shippers access via one railroad also is going to be a very, very big step forward. So when I look at this, if I were talking about a base case, I would say let's look at a base case 10 years from now where the trucking industry has had all these huge productivity increases and railroad traffic is greatly diminished. That to me is the base case that this merger ought to be compared against.
And that's a very good point. And yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see how much growth that you see out of trucking and what kind of agreements that they will strike with railroads, if they will at all. Because let's remember, we go back to the 1990s, and you worked on this, right? J.B. Hunt, working together with Santa Fe, which was a landmark deal at the time.
At the time, you know, just almost a few months earlier, you had, or maybe a year or two earlier, the railroads had gotten the national truck size and weight freeze passed. The railroads and the truckers were at loggerheads. I mean, they were fighting each other tooth and nail. So at the time, that was a really, really big development for the railroads and the trucking industry.
Right. And so will those agreements continue? I know BNSF just renewed that agreement in some form with J.B. Hunt, but when you're looking at autonomous trucking writ large, maybe those sort of agreements may not be in their interest to do. So that could set off, as you say, a new era of very, very aggressive competition, which will ultimately benefit the consumer, and that's a positive thing, but it is important that railroads position themselves in order to take advantage of it. So I agree, that's one of the reasons I think you're seeing this merger.
Yeah, and as we try to reindustrialize the United States, that means we're going to be shipping more raw materials. So if you're a chemical shipper, if you're someone that ships aggregates where trucking probably is never going to be a very good option, you really want that intermodal traffic because that traffic, again, helps cover all those costs that Phil was talking about earlier.
Now, I'm going to ask you to speculate a little bit. So we have an idea of what might happen, Union Pacific-Norfolk Southern, assuming it's approved and no other competing offers or otherwise come in. What happens with the other dominoes? How could you see that falling?
Well, obviously, you look at the map and you say, well, gee, the obvious one is CSX and BNSF. Now, is that going to be the only option out there? Obviously, you could also have CSX then merge with either CP, Kansas City Southern, or they can go back to, or they can try to merge with the Canadian National. So there are all sorts of options out there right now. It might be exciting to have one national railroad that has an east-west kind of focus and another one that has a north-south focus. All of that traffic is very, very important to both our economy and the worldwide economy, I would also argue. So it's going to be exciting to see how this develops. I could just imagine the conversations that are being had right now.
Yep, I think that you're right, and I would say not to necessarily think anything is a done deal at this point, because we all remember what happened. Conrail and CSX, they had a great idea, let's merge and we're going to create this. Now, Norfolk Southern was not going to let that happen, and the minute they saw that, they said, no way. What's so interesting, out there on YouTube, there is video of David M. Levan, who was the CEO, having some internal meetings with Conrail employees to answer questions about the CSX-Conrail merger. And at one point, Mr. Levan says, well, we've got a consultant coming up with a new name for the combined company. And it was so interesting to watch that more than 25 years later, almost 30 years later, and the, I don't want to say hubris, but kind of the belief that, all right, well, we've got this deal done. Maybe we're going to have to do some concessions with Norfolk Southern, but we're going to get this done. And of course, none of that came to pass. It ended up looking completely different at the end. So this deal could look completely different. Who knows what a CSX merger with another company could look like? There might even be a situation where you could end up with something like 2.5 transcontinentals that are combined with the Canadian transcontinentals, and that everybody is kind of focused on that east-west traffic. And then what does that say for your north-south traffic? Because that's always been an interesting divide in terms of how do we move, what direction do we focus on as a company? So that's always a big deal. So there's a lot to think about, and I will, as we get out of here, one more interesting tidbit. So I don't know if you remember this, but before the Southern Railway merged with the Norfolk and Western to create NS, the Southern had almost merged with the Missouri Pacific. They were talking, and then they decided to take a break, and I guess just like if you're dating, if you take a break, that's bad. So they took a break, and during that break, the N&W swooped in and ended up buying the Southern. And as David Good puts it, it was something like 50.1% Norfolk and Western, 49.9% Southern in the final wash. Well, if this transaction goes through, you will see the Southern united with the Missouri Pacific in a roundabout way, because the Missouri Pacific ended up being purchased by UP. And some would say that a lot of the MP, MOPAC, or MOP, depending on how you say it, DNA, kind of went up to create the modern day Union Pacific. So it's interesting to look at that from a historical perspective too.
Phil, I'll bet you're one of the few people in the United States that can come up with that kind of perspective. But that's why I love talking to you.
Thank you, David. Well, it's always a pleasure to have you here. The All Aboard Podcast by All Things Trains, special joint podcast with the Center for Transportation Advancement. You're going to see some more podcasts over on the C4TA Facebook page and also YouTube channel. We'll put the links in the description here. Also, head on over to towerkgroup.com/events today and get your tickets to the Advancing Transportation Conference. You won't want to miss it. This is going to be the premier policymaking conference for the transportation industry this year and every year following, so you want to be in this year. So we will see you down the line. As always, stay sharp, stay strong, and stay free right here on the All Aboard podcast by All Things Trans.